She lay on cold concrete in the dark, listening to wind strike sheet metal somewhere above her in long, hollow pulses. The ceiling was invisible except where a faint gray seam of moonlight caught the edge of a water stain, its shape spreading across peeling paint like a map of a country she had never visited and would never leave. Her hands rested on her chest, palms down, and she could feel the ridges of old scars across the backs of her fingers without looking at them the way a blind person reads a page. 43 years of metal pipes, soldering torches, frozen valves, and crawl spaces too tight for most men had written an autobiography across her skin, and tonight, every chapter ached. Beside her, a man lay on his side with one arm folded beneath a coat that served as a pillow. His breathing was too even, too controlled. She knew he was awake because after 45 years of sleeping next to the same body, the rhythms of genuine rest became as recognizable as a heartbeat. He was performing sleep the way a nurse performs calm in front of a frightened child, and the tenderness of that small deception made her throat tighten more than the cold. At least the ceiling has never betrayed anyone, she thought, and closed her eyes against the darkness. 6 weeks earlier, the ceiling above Elena Marsh had been white plaster, with a hairline crack running from the kitchen light fixture to the corner above the pantry door. A crack she had patched twice, and that kept returning every spring when the Ohio frost released its grip on the foundation. She had stopped minding it. A house that old was entitled to its habits. The kitchen smelled of coffee brewed through an aluminum filter that had turned the color of weak tea from decades of use. Morning light came through the window above the sink and fell across the wooden table in a single bright rectangle, catching the dust motes that rose whenever someone sat down. Eleanor stood at the counter, with her back to the room, pouring coffee into two ceramic mugs. One with a chipped handle she always kept for herself because the chip fit the curve of her thumb, in a way that felt deliberate, as though the mug had broken itself into the right shape just for her. Harold Marsh sat at the table in a flannel shirt buttoned one hole off, which Eleanor noticed and did not mention. He was reading the back of a cereal box because the newspaper had stopped being delivered 3 weeks ago, and neither of them had called to complain. He wore reading glasses low on his nose, and his hair, still thick but entirely white, now stood at angles that suggested he had slept on it wrong and had not yet encountered a mirror. At 70 years old, Harold had the kind of face that rearranged itself completely depending on whether he was listening or speaking. When he listened, his features settled into a stillness that made people trust him without understanding why. When he spoke, his eyebrows moved first, as though scouting ahead for the right words, and his voice carried the particular gentleness of a man who had spent 32 years sitting beside sick children and pretending the thermometer was a magic wand. Eleanor set his mug down and sat across from him. The table between them was something she had built in 1994 from reclaimed oak, sanded and sealed over a long weekend while Harold kept the three children fed and entertained upstairs. The surface bore the usual archaeology of family life. A ring stain from a coffee mug that had sat too long. A shallow gouge near the edge from the time their oldest, Kevin, was 8 years old and had tried to hammer a nail into a block of wood using the kitchen table as a workbench. The hammer slipped. The table remembered. Eleanor drank her coffee and looked out the window at the backyard where the grass had gone yellow in patches, and the fence leaned slightly inward on the south side, a problem she had been meaning to fix for 2 months and kept forgetting. She frowned. She had also forgotten to bring the toolbox in from the back steps yesterday, or the day before that. It was sitting out there now, its red metal lid spotted with morning dew, and she could not remember why she had carried it outside in the first place. She set down her mug. The toolbox had been on the back steps for 5 minutes or 5 hours, she could not tell. She had walked outside with it gripped in her right hand, the hand that was stronger despite the old scar tissue. And then she had stopped at the top of the steps and stood there looking at the yard with the toolbox hanging at her side, like a pendulum that had forgotten how to swing. Something had needed fixing. Something always needed fixing in a house this old. But the specific thing, the task that had pulled her out of the kitchen with purpose in her stride, had simply evaporated, leaving her standing in the cold air, with no memory of why she was holding a 12-pound box of wrenches. Harold's voice reached her through the screen door. "What are you looking for?" Eleanor shook her head. Forgot. She laughed the short exhalation people use to dismiss a small stumble and came back inside. Harold watched her set the toolbox on the kitchen floor. He did not say anything else about it, but later that evening, when she asked him what time Diane had called on Sunday, and he reminded her it was Thursday, he noticed the way her eyes moved, not confused exactly, but searching as though the answer was written on the wall behind him in very small print. He had seen that look before. 32 years of reading children's faces had taught him the difference between a child who forgot their homework and a child who forgot where they were. Eleanor's look was closer to the first, but the fact that he was categorizing it at all sat in his chest like a stone. He did not mention it to her. Instead, he got up and took a small square of paper from the pad he kept near the phone, wrote Thursday, October 17th on it, and stuck it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a fish. Eleanor glanced at it but said nothing. Over the following weeks, Harold noticed more. She climbed the stairs more slowly, gripping the banister with both hands now instead of one. She asked the same question about the neighbor's dog twice during dinner, with exactly the same phrasing as though the first asking had been erased from a tape. She left the garden hose running overnight and found the backyard flooded in the morning, standing in the doorway looking at the mud with an expression that was not embarrassment, but something worse, a quiet bewilderment that she masked immediately by turning around and saying, "The ground needed the water anyway." But her hands were still perfect. She replaced the kitchen faucet on a Tuesday afternoon without consulting a manual, feeling her way through the threading. By touch, her fingers moving with the precise, unhurried authority of a surgeon. She heard a faint whistle in the basement pipes and diagnosed a pressure valve issue before Harold even registered the sound. She could still name every fitting in her toolbox by weight alone, picking up a brass elbow or a copper coupling, and identifying it without looking the way a pianist finds keys in the dark. Whatever was dimming the edges of her daily memory had not yet reached the center of who she was. That distinction mattered. It mattered because it meant the problem might be exhaustion. Chronic pain, years of poor sleep accumulated like unpaid debt in a body that had worked harder than most bodies ever would. It mattered because the alternative was something neither of them was willing to name. And it mattered because when Eleanor called Kevin the following week, she described it in the flattest possible terms, the way you report weather, not disaster. "Your father noticed I've been a little slower lately," she told him, keeping her voice level. She had swapped the subject deliberately. "Your father noticed, not I'm struggling." Let Kevin hear it as Harold's concern, not her confession. On the other end of the line, Kevin was quiet for a beat. Then, "I'll look into it." He said it the way he said everything, with the clipped efficiency of a man who managed projects and timelines for a living, and had long ago stopped distinguishing between tasks that required his heart and tasks that required only his calendar. "You don't need to look into anything. I just thought you should know." I said, "I'll handle it, Mom." He hung up. Eleanor held the phone against her ear for another 3 seconds, listening to the dead air, then set it down on the counter next to Harold's fish magnet. She stared at the magnet for a moment at the word Thursday in Harold's careful handwriting and felt something shift beneath her ribs, not pain, but the premonition of it, the way the air changes before a storm without a single cloud yet visible. 2 years passed inside that silence. Kevin called less frequently, and when he did, the conversations were brief and administrative, as though Eleanor and Harold were tenants in a building he managed remotely. Diane called on Sundays, asked how they were listened, for exactly as long as politeness required, and hung up. Scott, the youngest, had drifted so far into his life on the West Coast that his communications had shrunk from calls to texts to occasional emoji reactions on photographs Harold posted of the garden. Eleanor kept working. She fixed the fence. She replaced the downspout. She recaulked the bathroom and rebuilt the front steps, when the third plank from the top finally rotted through. Her body protested every morning, her right shoulder burning like a coal when she raised her arm above her head, her knees grinding on the stairs. But the work itself remained clean and precise, and as long as her hands remembered what her mind occasionally forgot, she could look at herself in the bathroom mirror and see a woman who was still whole. Harold kept his notes, the refrigerator filled with small squares of paper, each one a date, a reminder, a name, a dosage. He had always been a man who wrote things down even when memory was not at stake. At the school where he worked, the other nurses teased him about his sticky notes, the ones he left on the medicine cabinet, on the attendance binder, on the inside of the first aid kit. But those notes had served a different purpose then. They were organizational. Now they were something else, a net stretched beneath a trapeze just in case. He never told Eleanor that the notes were for her. When she asked, he said they were for both of them. She knew he was lying. She also knew that the lie was made of love, and she let it stand the way she let the crack in the kitchen ceiling stand. Because some things you fix and some things you live beside. Then one Saturday in early March, when the last of the winter snow had melted into grey slush along the curb, and the crocuses had not yet pushed through the ground, a black SUV pulled up in front of the house on Alder Street and stopped with its engine running. Kevin got out first. He was wearing a wool overcoat that Eleanor did not recognize and shoes that were too polished for a visit home. Diane climbed out of the passenger side slower, her eyes already aimed at the ground. Scott was not there. Eleanor was in the kitchen. Harold was near the sink, a dish towel still in his hand, looking through the window at the SUV, the way you look at an ambulance parked outside a neighbor's house, with that instinctive contraction of dread that arrives before any facts do. The front door opened without a knock. Kevin walked in carrying a leather briefcase and an expression that Harold recognized immediately, the face of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and was determined to deliver it before anyone could interrupt. Diane followed 2 steps behind him, her coat still buttoned, her hands in her pockets, looking at nothing. "We found a solution," Kevin announced, setting the briefcase on the kitchen table with a soft thud that landed on the oak surface directly over the old hammer gouge. Eleanor put down her mug. "A solution to what? A better living arrangement, safer, with proper support services." Harold set the dish towel on the counter. He did not fold it. "We're not looking for another place." Kevin pressed on as though Harold had not spoken. "It's temporary. This house isn't sustainable anymore. Property taxes went up again. The roof will need replacement within 2 years. The heating system is 30 years old." "The heating system?" Eleanor repeated, and something in her voice made Diane look up for the first time. "I installed that heating system. I know exactly how old it is and exactly how many winters it has left." Kevin sighed and rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man being patient with people who did not understand their own situation. "Mom, we've talked about this." They never had. The word "we" hung in the kitchen like smoke. Eleanor looked at Diane, who was standing behind Kevin the way a person stands behind the shield. "You knew about this?" Diane nodded without raising her eyes. Her chin dipped once, a movement so small it could have been mistaken for a swallow. Harold had been watching Kevin's face throughout the conversation, reading it the way he had once read the faces of hundreds of children, and what he saw alarmed him far more than the words coming out of his son's mouth. Kevin was not worried. Kevin was not even particularly engaged. He was performing concern the way an actor performs grief in a daytime television show, hitting the marks without ever touching the emotion beneath them. His eyes were not scanning the kitchen, looking for problems to solve. They were scanning it the way a real estate appraiser scans a room, measuring square footage, noting fixtures, calculating. Harold set this observation aside for the moment. He watched Eleanor instead. She was standing with one hand flat on the counter, the other hanging at her side, and he could see the tension running up her forearm into her shoulder. The bad shoulder. The one that sat lower than the left from the winter accident in 1987. She was looking around the kitchen at the table she had built, the knife rack she had mounted, the scratch from the hammer, the window she had reframed 2 summers ago. She was looking at everything she had made and maintained for 4 decades, and for the first time in their marriage, Harold saw her face do something it had never done before. It asked for permission, not from Kevin, from him. He understood what she was asking. She was asking whether she should fight this right now in this kitchen, with her fists up and her voice loud, or whether she should go quietly because Harold, who read faces better than anyone she had ever known, was telling her something with his eyes that she did not want to hear. And the truth was, Harold was not sure. He was worried about her. Not the way Kevin was pretending to be worried, but genuinely deeply, in the way that wakes you at 3 in the morning and sends you downstairs to check that the stove is off, even though you watched her turn it off yourself. He had watched her forget the toolbox and the hose and the day of the week. And even though her hands were still perfect, even though she could still hear water, the way other people hear music, the edges were softening, and he did not know what that meant. So when Eleanor looked at him, asking with her eyes whether to fight or fold, Harold hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but she saw it. She agreed. Kevin did not take them to any care facility. Eleanor noticed this the moment the SUV turned left instead of right at the end of Alder Street, heading not toward the medical complex on the west side of town, but east toward the old industrial corridor, where the buildings grew smaller and the sidewalks cracked. She said nothing. Harold, sitting beside her in the back seat, watched the streets pass through the window with his hands folded in his lap and his face very still. The car stopped in front of a 4-story apartment building on the edge of town. The brick facade was streaked with rust stains running down from the window frames like dry tears. The entrance had a glass door with a crack running diagonally across it, repaired with clear packing tape. The hallway inside smelled of carpet cleaner and boiled vegetables, and the elevator made a sound when it moved that was less mechanical than organic, as though something alive and tired was pulling the cables. "Just a few weeks," Kevin said as he opened the trunk. He handed Harold one suitcase and carried the other himself to the second floor. Walking ahead of them without looking back, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum with the brisk rhythm of a man who was already mentally elsewhere. The apartment was a single room with a kitchenette built into one wall and a bathroom behind a door that did not close all the way. The window faced a parking lot where the asphalt was cratered with potholes filled with brown water. The walls were the color of old teeth. A radiator under the window hissed intermittently, producing heat in thin, unreliable waves. Kevin set the suitcase down and placed a key on the small table near the door. "I'll take care of the rest." He straightened his coat. He did not look around the room. He did not look at his mother's face or his father's hands, or the window or the walls or any of the surfaces that would become the boundaries of their lives. He looked at his watch. The door closed behind him. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, and then the elevator groaned, and then nothing. Eleanor stood in the center of the room. Her arms hung at her sides the way they hung when she finished a long job, and her muscles were too tired to know what to do next. The room was 12 feet by 14 feet. She had estimated that without measuring. 43 years of measuring rooms by eye. Harold sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged toward the center, with the resignation of something that had held too many bodies for too many nights. He opened his bag, looked at the photograph inside the family photograph in the frame that had once held his certificate of appreciation from the school, and closed the bag again. Outside, a truck passed, and the window shook in its frame, a small rattle that traveled through the glass and into the wall, and into the floor, and into the soles of Eleanor's work boots where it died. The next morning, Harold rose before Eleanor, which was unusual. He had always been the first to wake in the house on Alder Street, moving through the early dark with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to not disturbing sleeping children. But here in this room that smelled of strangers and disinfectant, Eleanor had not slept well. Her shoulder had locked during the night, and she had spent an hour lying on her back with her arms stretched out at an unnatural angle, waiting for the joint to release, listening to the radiator tick like a slow clock counting down something she did not want to reach. Harold made coffee with the aluminum filter. When the smell reached Eleanor, she opened her eyes and sat up on the edge of the bed, moving carefully, testing each joint before trusting it with weight. He handed her the chipped mug. She took it to the window. In the parking lot below, a man in a reflective vest was directing a furniture truck backward into a loading bay. Two workers carried an old armchair through the ground floor entrance, struggling with the weight the fabric torn along one arm. Eleanor watched them and thought, this building is full of people whose lives are in between. She did not say this aloud. Instead, she turned from the window and opened the small toolbox she had brought with her, the portable one that fit inside the suitcase, the one containing only essentials. A crescent wrench, needle nose pliers, electrical tape, a small torpedo level, a box cutter. She picked up each tool, turned it in her hands, and named it quietly, not for Harold's benefit, but for her own. Crescent wrench 3/8, pliers needle nose 7-inch, level, tape, cutter. She was running diagnostics on herself the way she would check a system before trusting it with pressure. If she could name every tool by touch, if her hands still recognized the weight and shape and purpose of each one, then whatever Kevin thought was wrong with her had not yet reached the part that mattered. Harold watched this ritual from the kitchen corner. He understood what she was doing. He also understood that it was the first time in their marriage she had felt the need to do it. And that fact opened a door in his chest that he immediately closed and locked and stood in front of. Near noon, Kevin called. Harold answered on the first ring. "I'm in a meeting." No greeting, no transition. "But don't worry, everything's being handled. I need to go back to the house and pick up more of our things." On the other end, papers shuffled and a voice murmured something indistinct. "That's not going to work right now." What does "not going to work" mean? The house is in the middle of paperwork processing. The brokerage is doing an inventory. Harold straightened. The word brokerage moved through his body like voltage, snapping every synapse to attention. "What brokerage?" Kevin paused. The pause was too short to be called hesitation, but long enough for Harold to hear it shape the shape of a man choosing between several prepared lies and selecting the most efficient one. "Just let me handle it." Harold gripped the phone. His eyes found Eleanor across the room, where she was sitting on the edge of the bed, with the wrench still in her hand. "Kevin, what have you done?" "I did what needed to be done." The line went dead. Harold lowered the phone and stood motionless for several seconds. His hand still raised the phone, pressed against silence. Eleanor had heard his voice change. She had not heard Kevin's words, but she did not need to. Harold's face was telling her everything, and Harold's face never lied. "I want to go home," she said. They took the town bus. Eleanor sat by the window with one hand on her knee, watching the streets slide past with the patient attention of someone memorizing a route they might need to retrace in the dark. When the bus turned onto Alder Street, she sat forward. Harold saw her spine straighten, her chin lift, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had looked 30 years ago, riding beside him to a job site, alert and purposeful and absolutely certain of where she was going. The house appeared at the end of the road. Gray shingles, wooden porch, the empty flower pot beside the front steps that she kept meaning to plant something in every spring and never did. Everything the same, everything except the lock on the front door. Eleanor stepped onto the porch. She took the old key from her jacket pocket and inserted it into the lock and turned. Nothing. She withdrew the key, looked at it, inserted it again, and turned harder, as though force could override the fact that the lock's internal geometry had been rewritten to exclude her. A sheet of paper had been taped to the corner of the door glass. Property transfer notice. Contact the new management unit. No entry without prior appointment. Eleanor pulled the paper down. She read half of the first line, stopped, and looked at the lock again. "I didn't sign anything." Her voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that is not softness but compression, like steam trapped in a pipe with nowhere to go. Harold moved to the side window and pulled back the curtain. Inside, the living room had changed. Cardboard boxes lined one wall. Eleanor's armchair was gone from its usual place by the radiator. On the dining table, a roll of packing tape sat beside a stack of documents, their edges perfectly aligned. The neighbor's door opened. Evelyn crossed the street, still holding her gardening gloves, her face already tight with the particular discomfort of someone who has witnessed something they wish they could unsee. Harold turned to her. "Did you know about this?" Evelyn looked at the house, then at them, her mouth working for a moment before the words came. "I thought you two had already moved out. Last week people from some company came. A white truck. They had jackets with a logo. They said the family had arranged everything." "What company?" "I don't remember the name. I thought Kevin had hired them. I'm sorry, I should have called." Eleanor stepped down from the porch slowly. She walked around the side of the house, past the window where the kitchen light was off, to the back door. The back door, which she had hung on its hinges herself in the summer of 2006 on a weekend when Scott was home from college and kept dropping the box of screws in the yard and laughing about it. That door had a new lock too. She stood there for a long time, looking at the wood, at the hinges, at the frame she had shimmered and leveled with her own hands, until the gap was perfectly even on all four sides. Harold followed her and placed his hand on her arm, on the sleeve of her jacket, just above the elbow. "Ellie," she did not turn. "I hung this door 17 years ago. I know. Scott dropped the screws. I know." She still did not turn, but she did not pull her arm away. The following morning, Eleanor called the county clerk's office from the apartment phone. She explained the situation in the same flat voice she used for everything. The voice that had once made foremen on construction sites listen to her even when they did not want to, because it carried no emotion that could be dismissed and no weakness that could be exploited. The clerk confirmed it. A transfer document bearing the signature of Elena Marsh had been filed. The property on Alder Street was in the process of conveyance. "That's not my signature," Eleanor said. The clerk was quiet for a moment. "You'd need to file a formal dispute. The process takes 6 to 12 months. You'd need legal representation." "How much does legal representation cost?" Another pause. "It depends." Eleanor thanked the clerk and hung up. She stood in the kitchen corner of the apartment with her hand still on the phone, and for the first time since the SUV had arrived on Alder Street, she felt the full weight of what had been done to her. Not the loss of the house, though, that was enormous. Not the betrayal by her son, though that was worse. It was the signature. Someone had written her name on a piece of paper, had mimicked the shape of her handwriting. The handwriting she used to label pipe fittings and sign work orders and write birthday cards to her grandchildren, and had used that forgery to erase 40 years of her life from a county ledger. Her hand trembled, not from weakness, from the effort of containing something that had no container. On the bus back from the county office, she sat beside Harold and looked out at the passing streets and said, without turning her head, "I'm going to get that house back. But first we need somewhere to stand." Harold heard the sentence divide itself into two halves. The first half a promise and the second half a plan. And he recognized in that division the same woman who had walked onto the construction site at Lincoln Elementary School in 1983 and told the foreman she would have the 4-inch pipe welded before lunch. She had. And then she had welded more after lunch. 3 days later, the apartment building manager delivered the news. A woman with dark red nail polish and the flat voice of someone who had repeated the same announcement too many times sat behind the reception desk and did not look up from her screen. "This facility is closing in 3 weeks. Budget cuts. The building doesn't meet safety standards for renewal. Residents are required to find alternative housing." Harold stood beside Eleanor, his hands at his sides. 3 weeks. "Your family brought you here, correct? Our son. Then you should contact your family. He isn't answering. The woman opened a drawer and pulled out a photocopied sheet folded into quarters. This is what I can offer. Shelters, community kitchens, senior assistance centers, churches, social services. Eleanor looked at the paper and did not take it. Harold accepted it, folded it once more, and put it in his bag. They walked to the bus stop in cold wind. The sky was the color of old concrete. Eleanor stopped in front of the thrift store on the corner and looked through the glass at a display of table lamps and chipped kitchen chairs, arranged with the hopeful indifference of objects that had outlived their original purposes. "How much do we have left?" she asked. Harold opened his wallet and counted without removing the bills. $142. Eleanor nodded. "Not enough for long." "I know." That afternoon, Harold went alone to the county administrative building. He told Eleanor to stay at the apartment because her knee was bothering her after the long walk. Which was true, but the deeper truth was that he needed to sit across from someone behind a desk without having to watch his wife be looked at. The way people look at the elderly, who have nowhere to go with that particular mixture of pity and relief that the looking person is not yet in the same position. The building smelled of paper dust and radiators running too hot. He stood at the front counter and waited while a young clerk with round glasses checked records on a computer screen. Her fingers moving across the keyboard with the absent speed of someone who had typed 10,000 searches before this one and would type 10,000 more. "I need to ask about emergency housing," Harold said. "Not a one-night shelter, somewhere actually livable, very cheap." The clerk typed, scanned, frowned. Something on the screen caught her attention. She leaned closer. "There's a city property that's been on the liquidation list for years. Nobody wants it." "What is it?" "An old fire station on the eastern edge of the county off Mason Ridge Road, decommissioned in the late 90s. Harold was silent. "The transfer fee is symbolic." The young woman continued, glancing up at him. "The city just wants to get rid of the maintenance liability." "Does it have a roof?" She blinked the way people blink when a question catches them in a place between professional and human. "According to the file, yes, the steel frame is still intact, but I've never been out there personally." "How much?" She looked at the bottom of the screen. Then she looked up at Harold with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life because it contained exactly two things: the information she was about to deliver and the recognition that the man standing in front of her was about to make a decision that would be either the bravest or the most desperate act of his life, and that there might not be a difference between the two. $7, she said. "Minimum transfer fee." Harold wrote the address on the back of a discarded form. He folded the paper carefully, placed it in his bag next to the shelter list he would never use, and walked out into the cold. When he returned to the apartment, Eleanor was sitting at the table with her morning coffee gone completely cold in front of her. She had not moved since he left. She had been sitting there, he realized, with her hands wrapped around the mug, waiting the way she waited when a pipe system was pressurizing and she needed to listen for the first sign of a leak. She looked up the moment the door opened. Harold took off his coat, sat down across from her, took the piece of paper from his bag and placed it in the center of the table directly on the surface between them, the way you place a card face up when you have nothing left to bluff with. "An old fire station, abandoned for a long time, out on Mason Ridge." Eleanor looked at the address. "How much at $7? She looked up. $7. Minimum transfer fee. Eleanor leaned back. The kitchen was so small that her knees nearly touched the lower cabinet. She looked at the paper, then at Harold, then at the paper again. He knew the look. He had lived with it for 45 years, long enough to know when she was calculating with her eyes instead of with words. She was not imagining a shelter or a desperate last option. She was seeing steel beams, concrete flooring, junction points for drainage systems, load-bearing walls and roof pitch, and the distance from a utility pole to a meter box. She was reading a building she had never seen, constructing it in her mind from a single address and a $7 price tag. "Let's go see it," she said. They borrowed Pastor Whitfield's car the next morning. The pastor was a tall, narrow man who drove with both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 and did not ask questions. Since helping them move into the apartment, he had learned the discipline of useful silence, the art of offering a ride without offering an opinion, because some people do not need to be told that their situation is difficult. They need a car. Mason Ridge Road ran past fields of dead grass and a few rusting equipment sheds, where old combines and disc harrows sat beneath tarps that had blown half off in winter storms. After 12 miles, the asphalt narrowed, and the road surface became a patchwork of repairs, each one a different shade of black, like a quilt made by someone who kept running out of matching fabric. The fire station appeared at the end of an open lot, set slightly back from the road with a row of bare-branched oaks behind it. It was smaller than Eleanor had expected, but it was built like a fist. Red brick 2 stories 3 wide garage doors across the front, their silver paint peeling in long vertical strips that curled away from the metal like old skin. On the roof, a low hose tower. On the side, a rusted flagpole with no flag, its empty halyard clinking in the wind. The station number on the front facade had faded to a ghost just barely visible, like a name on a headstone that Rain had been working on for decades. Eleanor got out of the car and stood still. She did not move toward the building. She did not speak. She stood with her feet slightly apart and her head tilted to one side, and her eyes tracking across every surface, every edge, every joint and seam and line of mortar, the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not looking for what is obvious, but for what is hiding. Harold did not rush her. He knew this posture. Years ago, she had stood exactly this way in front of a cracked kitchen wall in their first apartment, the one before Alder Street, the one where the landlord had said the wall was cosmetic, and Eleanor had said the wall was structural, and Eleanor had been right. "The bricks are still good," she said. Pastor Whitfield tried the handle on the side door. It was unlocked. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed once a long rusty protest that echoed through the empty building and died somewhere in the back. The smell came first: dust, old engine oil, damp wood, and beneath those the faint chemical ghost of extinguisher foam, the memory of a building that had once existed for the single purpose of rushing toward danger. The first room had been the duty station. A long counter, filing cabinets with broken drawers, and a shiftboard on the wall that still carried marker traces from 1998, the last year anyone had written a name or a time or a task on its surface. Eleanor kept moving. Through the hallway to the old kitchen where an industrial sink sat beneath 2 windows caked with dust so thick it functioned as a curtain. Stainless steel counters dull to the color of old pewter. Cabinet doors hanging at angles. A drain in the floor clogged with something that had once been organic and was now geological. Into the front garage. All 3 bays empty. The concrete floor cracked in places but not yet sunken. The ceiling high and open steel framework exposed the bones of the building, visible and honest, in a way that finished buildings never are. In the left corner, a metal hose rack still bolted to the wall. At the far end, the locker room. A row of metal lockers standing at attention like soldiers who had not been dismissed. A communal bathroom with fixtures that had turned green. Harold followed her through every room, watching not the building, but her face. He was measuring the station with a different instrument than hers. She was measuring structure. He was measuring possibility. The duty counter could become a kitchen. The locker room could be divided into small rooms. Upstairs, the shared sleeping quarters. The long open room where firefighters had once slept in shifts might still be usable if the floor held weight, and the windows could be replaced. And someone was willing to do more work than any 2 people in their 70s should reasonably be asked to do. Eleanor climbed the stairs. Each step groaned once beneath her weight, but did not give. At the top, a long corridor with high windows and empty bunk frames, just screw holes in the floor, where the beds had been pulled out and carried away. The room at the end of the hallway had a window that faced east. And when she stepped inside, the morning light came through the dirty glass and laid a bright rectangle on the floorboards that looked for just a moment exactly like the rectangle of light that fell across the kitchen table on Alder Street. Harold stood in the doorway. This room gets light. Eleanor touched the windowsill. The wood was soft in places, but the frame was sound. She turned and looked back down the hallway, down the stairs, down into the garage, down at the whole building, as though the answer to every question she had ever been afraid to ask was hidden somewhere in its geometry. Not right away, she said, but yes. They walked around to the back. An old water tank, half buried and half exposed, its surface covered in flaking green paint. A generator beneath a small corrugated shelter. A steel door leading to the supply storage room. Harold tried the outdoor faucet on the back wall. Nothing came out. Electricity. Eleanor looked at the line running from the nearest utility pole to a meter box that had been sealed shut with a metal clamp. Don't know yet. Pastor Whitfield stood beside them with his hands in his coat pockets, his long face grave. Are you too sure about this? Harold opened his wallet. He counted the bills without removing them, then pulled out 7 singles and laid them flat on his palm where they sat like something much heavier than paper. We have 135 left after this. Eleanor looked at the money. Then she looked at the fire station, its brick face, its steel bones, its empty garage mouths open to the wind like a building trying to say something it had forgotten the words for. If we buy this place, she said, we'll be sleeping on the floor for at least a few days. At least it'll be our own floor. Nobody throws us out after opening the door. She looked at him. Wind moved through the empty yard, lifting dry dust in low spirals around their feet. Can you live here? He asked. She held his gaze. I can live anywhere no one takes the key after I close my eyes. Pastor Whitfield took the 7 bills. I'll submit it at the county office on the way back. Eleanor turned to him. Pastor? He waited. If they ask whether I'm sure. She paused, her eyes still on the front of the fire station, on the brick and steel and peeling paint and the ghost of a station number that had faded but not disappeared. Tell them my husband is. They moved out of the apartment before dark that same afternoon. There was not much to carry. 2 suitcases, a bag of groceries, thin blankets, medicine, the aluminum coffee filter, the family photograph Harold still kept in his bag. Pastor Whitfield drove them out to Mason Ridge in his pickup, the bed of the truck holding everything they owned, which was not enough to fill it. The truck stopped in front of the garage, just as the last sunlight of the day was lifting off the roof, turning the old brick the color of embers. Eleanor carried the first suitcase inside. She chose the old duty room because it was near the door near the kitchen, and more sheltered from the draft that came howling through the garage bays when the wind shifted. She pushed a broken table against the wall and used it as a surface for their things. Harold spread a blanket over the tabletop to cover the stains, then arranged the medicine bottles, the wallet, and the photograph on it, with the careful precision of a man setting a table for dinner, as though the arrangement itself could persuade a hostile place to yield. By the time full dark arrived, they had made a sleeping corner on the concrete floor, with folded coats for padding, and a double blanket on top. Harold tore the lining from the old suitcase and tied it across the window in the duty room to block the view from outside, though there was no one outside to look in. Nothing but the empty lot and the bare trees and the road that led back to a town that had not noticed they were gone. Eleanor lay down on the concrete. She placed both hands behind her head and looked up at the ceiling at the water stain, spreading across the peeling paint at the faint gray seam where the moonlight caught its edge. Tomorrow I'll look at the garage, she said. I'll clean the kitchen, Harold answered. Outside, wind struck the garage doors in short bursts, dry and hollow and repetitive, like a stranger knocking on a door that no one was going to answer. Eleanor listened. She listened to the building the way she had spent her entire life listening to the systems she was hired to repair, searching for the frequency that meant a joint was holding a valve, was seated, a run of pipe was sound. But tonight, there was no familiar frequency, no furnace hum, no creak of wooden floors when Harold got up for water in the middle of the night. Only metal and concrete and wind, the vocabulary of a building that had not been spoken to in 25 years. She thought, my son changed the locks on my house. My son wrote my name on a paper I never touched. My son drove me to a room I did not choose and left without looking back. One tear slid from the corner of her eye across her temple and into her hair. She did not wipe it away. Harold lay beside her, his eyes open, facing the ceiling. He did not turn toward her. He did not say her name. He reached across the darkness between them and placed his hand on top of hers, on the scarred, calloused, precise hand that had built and fixed and held together more things than either of them could count, and he held it there without speaking. Because some silences are not empty. Some silences are the only room large enough to hold what needs to be held. She did not pull her hand away. After a long time, after the wind had settled, and the garage doors had stopped shaking, and the only sound left was the slow tick of the building cooling in the night air. Harold looked at the bare wall beside the table where the medicine and the photograph and the wallet sat in their careful arrangement. He thought about the pad of paper in his bag. He thought about the fish magnet on the refrigerator on Alder Street, where a note that said, Thursday, October 17th, was stuck to a door that no longer belonged to them. Tomorrow he decided he would stick the first note on this wall. He did not yet know what he would write on it, but a blank wall needs at least one piece of paper before it can start becoming home. He closed his eyes. Eleanor's hand was still beneath his warm despite the cold. Somewhere in the old fire station, a pipe in the wall made a single sound, a faint metallic click like a lock opening. Eleanor heard it. And for the first time since the SUV had pulled up on Alder Street, something in her chest loosened just slightly, just enough to let her breathe without her ribs aching. She knew that sound. She had listened for it her entire working life. It was the sound a system makes when pressure finds its path. The first light found Eleanor already standing in the front garage, her breath visible in the cold air. Her hands wrapped around the chain of the leftmost roll-up door. She pulled. The door rose 3 inches, seized hard against rust in the track, and refused to move further. She did not force it. She released the chain and stepped back and tilted her head and looked upward at the steel framework the way a doctor studies an image when the patient is still breathing. But the prognosis is complicated. The bones were good. The I-beams ran straight across the ceiling without sag or twist, their flanges still sharp-edged despite 25 years of neglect. The roof decking above them showed water stains, but no rot, no daylight punching through. This building had been engineered to hold the weight of ladders and hose racks and the vibration of diesel engines idling at 3 in the morning. And that engineering had outlasted its purpose the way a strong skeleton outlasts the body built around it. She walked the perimeter of all 3 bays, running her fingers along the walls at shoulder height, feeling for cracks in the mortar, soft spots in the brick, any place where water had found a seam and worked its way inward. The brick was cold and dry. At the back of the 3rd bay near the floor, she found a horizontal crack running about 4 feet, its edges darkened with old moisture. She knelt down, pressed her thumb into the mortar, and felt it crumble slightly. Repointing needed. Not urgent, but not forgettable. She made a mental note and moved on because the supply room at the back of the building was calling to her the way an unopened toolbox calls to a mechanic who has been working barehanded. The steel door opened with one hard yank. Inside, the darkness was total until her eyes adjusted and the shapes began to separate themselves from shadow. Broken metal shelving along the left wall. A cardboard box on its side spilling rusted nails across the floor. Several cut lengths of copper pipe, their ends green with oxidation. A hand truck lying on its side like a fallen soldier. And on the back shelf, half hidden beneath a canvas tarp stiff with age, a box of mixed fasteners, bolts, lag screws, and a handful of stainless steel hose clamps that were worth more to her at this moment than anything in any bank account she no longer had. Harold appeared in the doorway behind her, holding the broom he had found leaning against the duty counter. "Is there water?" "Not yet." He walked around to the backyard while she continued cataloging the supply room's contents with the focused intensity of a woman taking inventory of her own survival. Near the eastern fence, behind a patch of wild grass that had grown waist-high, Harold found a hand faucet attached to a pipe rising from the ground. The pipe was nearly invisible beneath the brush, and the valve handle was seized with corrosion. He called Eleanor. She came out, gripped the valve with both hands, and torqued it. Nothing. She adjusted her stance, planted her boots wider, and tried again, putting her legs into it this time, and the valve broke free with a dry crack that sounded like a small bone snapping. Water burst out, brown and thick with rust, spattering across the dead grass. And then, gradually over 30 seconds, the color faded from brown to amber to pale yellow to something approaching clear. Eleanor caught some in her cupped palm, held it up, smelled it, examined the color against the morning sky. "Not safe to drink yet, but enough for cleaning." Harold nodded. "That's enough for the morning." They worked in parallel until nearly noon, each in their own zone of the building, communicating through the sounds of labor rather than words. Eleanor dragged the metal table from the supply room into the old kitchen, positioned it where the original prep counter had been, and turned her attention to the industrial sink. The drain was clogged solid with 2 decades of mineral deposits and organic debris compressed into something resembling it. She found a length of steel wire in the garage, bent it into a hook, and worked it into the drain from above, breaking the blockage apart in chunks that she pulled out and dropped into a bucket with the patient persistence of a dentist extracting a tooth that did not want to leave. Harold filled a bucket at the outdoor faucet and carried it inside, where he began wiping down the kitchen surfaces with a rag torn from an old undershirt, scrubbing each pressed wood cabinet door as though decades of grime were a tenant that could be evicted through sheer determination. By mid-morning, the kitchen had begun to shift from abandoned to inhabited. The sink drained. The countertop, though scarred and stained, was clean enough to set food on. The cabinet doors hung straighter after Harold tightened their hinges with a screwdriver from Eleanor's toolbox. And on the wall beside the doorway, Harold had stuck a small square of paper with a piece of electrical tape. It read, "Morning meds 7 o'clock, evening meds 9 o'clock." Eleanor saw it when she came in from the garage to wash her hands. She stood in front of it for a moment, reading the 2 lines, and felt something move through her that was neither anger nor gratitude, but something more complicated, a feeling that lived in the space between being cared for and being monitored. "Who's that for?" she asked without turning around. Harold was kneeling beside the lower cabinet, tightening a hinge. "Both of us." She knew that was not true. She also knew that if she said so, they would have to talk about the toolbox on the back steps, about the garden hose left running overnight, about the question she had asked twice at dinner without remembering the first time. And she was not ready for that conversation. Not here, not yet. Not in a building where they had slept on concrete and were drinking water they could not yet trust. She turned away from the note and went back to the garage. That night, when they lay down on the low bed frame, Eleanor had begun assembling from bricks and salvage boards. She turned her back to Harold for the first time since they had left Alder Street. He lay behind her in the dark, looking at the curve of her shoulder, and understood that the note had cost him something he could not yet calculate. The next morning, a pickup truck rattled into the yard and stopped in front of the garage with its engine ticking. Red Perkins climbed out slowly, his faded baseball cap pulled low, his boots finding the gravel with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to distrust his knees. He was 68 years old, built like a fence post, and his face had the permanent squint of someone who had spent 5 decades looking at things in bright light and deciding whether they were worth buying. He stood in the garage doorway and looked around the space, the way he looked at his own warehouse, assessing not just what was there, but what was missing, and what it would cost to fill the gap. Eleanor leaned against the hand truck she had righted and cleaned her arms crossed, waiting for whatever he was going to say. Heard it from Pastor Whitfield. Sounds like a hell of a story. We're living in the hell part of it. Red's eyes moved from the floor to the ceiling, to the duty counter, to the table Harold had cleaned. His expression was not pity. It was measurement, the look of a man doing arithmetic he had not been asked to do. What do you need first? Eleanor uncrossed her arms. She turned slowly, taking in the garage, the kitchen doorway, the hallway, the stairs. She was being given permission to calculate for real, to treat this place not as a catastrophe, but as a project. And the shift in framing was so enormous that she needed a moment to adjust to it. Boards, screws, insulation panels if you've got leftover stock, and a temporary stove. Red nodded. I've got some cut-off pieces in the back warehouse, loose screws by the pound. The stove, let me see. He looked past Eleanor at Harold, who had come to stand in the kitchen doorway. You all right? Haven't frozen to death yet, so I'm all right. Red made a sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh turned, and walked back to his truck. As he opened the driver's door, he paused with one hand on the frame and spoke without looking back, quietly, as though addressing the truck rather than any person. My wife used to say the same thing. Long as it's our own floor, it's enough. He was a veteran, Red, and his wife had died 5 years ago. And his daughter lived in a state he could not spell without looking it up. And the reason he was standing in the gravel yard of an abandoned fire station, offering free lumber to a woman he had sold pipe fittings to for 3 decades, was not charity. It was recognition. He saw in Eleanor and Harold a version of himself that had not happened yet, but could at any moment without warning, because that was how life worked for people who had spent their bodies earning their shelter. He got in the truck and drove away. He returned in the late afternoon. The truck bed was loaded with the kind of inventory that accumulates in the back corners of hardware stores. Over decades, the pieces too small to sell, but too useful to throw away. Odd-length boards, some pine, some plywood, their edges rough-cut. 2 rolls of old electrical wire, a box of mixed screws that rattled like a percussion instrument, a portable gas stove with a cracked handle and a small propane tank still half full. Eleanor looked at the pile, then at Red. I don't have money to pay for this right now. Nobody said I was selling. Red lifted the first board down from the bed. This stuff's been collecting dust for years. That stove isn't junk. Well, now it's my junk. Eleanor did not argue further. She took the propane tank with both hands, feeling its weight, feeling the liquid shift inside it, and carried it into the kitchen with the reverence of someone carrying a lamp into a dark room. That night, they had soup heated on the gas stove water to wash their faces, and a corner with a temporary partition Eleanor had built from 3 metal locker doors removed from the old changing room. The partition did not reach the ceiling, and it did not block all the draft from the garage. But it marked a boundary, and boundaries, even imperfect ones, are how a space begins to become a place. Eleanor was tightening the last bolt on the partition when the knock came. Not loud, not desperate. A single knock followed by silence, as though the person on the other side was already regretting the sound. Harold opened the front door. The woman standing outside was young, mid-20s, wearing a thin coat that was not adequate for the temperature, and shoes that had been walked in for a long time. Her hair was pulled back in a hasty knot at the nape of her neck. A backpack hung crooked on one shoulder. Her other hand rested beneath her belly, supporting its weight from below, in the unconscious gesture of a woman whose body had been carrying something heavier than it was designed for. Along the left side of her jaw, an old bruise had faded to yellow, the color of something that had happened long enough ago to be healing, but recently enough to still be readable. Sorry, I saw the light. Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled taut. My car died on the road. I walked here. I just need to borrow a phone. Come inside, Harold said. I don't want to be a bother. It's colder out there than it is in here. The young woman hesitated. Her eyes moved past Harold into the room, scanning the space, quickly cataloging exits and obstacles and distances, the rapid assessment of someone who had learned to map escape routes before sitting down. Then she stepped through the door. Harold pulled out a chair. Eleanor ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the table before anyone asked for a name. June. How far along? Harold asked, his voice carrying the particular gentleness he had once used with children who came to the nurse's office not because they were sick, but because they needed to be somewhere safe for 20 minutes. Almost 6 months. She picked up the spoon but did not eat. She looked at the soup, at the steam rising from it, at her own reflection in the liquid. There's nobody I want to go back to. Eleanor pulled out the chair across from June and sat down. Harold brought another chair from the corner and positioned it at the end of the table, but did not sit in it. He stood behind it with his hands resting on the back, watching June, the way he had watched hundreds of children over 32 years, reading the bruise on her jaw, reading the way she flinched at the sound of a car engine on the road outside, reading everything she was not saying in the spaces between the things she was. He did not ask. He did not need to. He had seen this alphabet written on too many young faces to need it spelled out. We have space upstairs, he said. If you need to stay tonight, I don't have any money. Nobody here charges for a meal they haven't finished cooking yet. June lowered her head and began to eat. The next morning, Eleanor built a bed frame for June from the boards Red had delivered, and 2 support bars removed from the locker room. She made it lower than her own, close to the ground, so a woman 6 months pregnant would not have to lift herself up each night or lower herself down each morning. She worked in the room at the end of the upstairs hallway, the room with the east-facing window, the room that got the most light. June stood in the doorway watching the work with both hands wrapped around a cup of warm water Harold had heated on the gas stove. She watched Eleanor measure without a tape, marking lengths by eye and cutting with a handsaw whose teeth were dull, but whose operator compensated with angle and pressure and patience. How long have you done this kind of work? Eleanor did not look up from the board she was cutting. Long enough to know what holds weight. Harold hung a piece of cloth across the doorway where the door was missing, placed a chair beside the window, and brought up a cup, a water jug, and a box of crackers. When June saw the room assembled, she stood in the curtained doorway for a long moment, her hand on the fabric, her eyes moving from the bed to the chair to the window, where sunlight was falling in a bright parallelogram across the floor. You don't have to do this for me. Harold straightened the blanket on the mattress. You're carrying 2 people. That makes it twice as necessary. Eleanor knelt beside the bed frame, driving a final screw into the joint where the rail met the leg. If you stay here, the room has to be decent. That's not generosity. That's construction code. June stayed 1 more day, then another. On the 4th day, she began appearing in the kitchen before Harold finished making coffee, helping with the cleaning, folding towels, scrubbing the countertop, as though the repetitive motion of her hands could silence whatever played on a loop inside her head when she was still. Frank Bell arrived on a Sunday morning, but not the way the others had come. His old sedan was parked at an angle in front of the garage when Eleanor came out to check the generator. And through the fogged windshield, she could see a figure sitting motionless in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing. She walked to the car and knocked on the glass. The window lowered slowly. The man inside was in his late 60s, clean-shaven that morning, but poorly, with a nick on his chin that had been dabbed with a piece of tissue paper still stuck there. He wore a suit jacket over a wrinkled dress shirt, a tie knotted with the muscle memory of a man who had once worn one every day, and a felt hat sat on the passenger seat beside a small brown leather suitcase and a paper pharmacy bag. You slept in here all night. Frank Bell looked at her with red-rimmed eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who had been tired for so long that tiredness had become his native state. I didn't know if I should come in. Eleanor opened the car door. Come in first. Talk later. In the kitchen, Harold poured coffee. Frank sat at the metal table with one hand resting on the surface as though steadying himself against a current only he could feel, and told his story in the short factual sentences of a man who had already told it to too many intake forms and church secretaries and bureaucratic strangers behind desks. His wife had died 2 years ago. The hospital bills had consumed the house. 3 months sleeping in his car. The last church where he had been parking overnight had told him the lot was being resurfaced and he could not stay. Eleanor had walked in during the last sentence. She wiped dust from her hands onto her work pants, looked at Frank for a moment, and did not offer the words he expected. She did not say, "There's a room upstairs." Instead, she asked a question that made Frank blink as though the lights had suddenly changed. "Do you know how to fix anything?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I was an accountant." "Then you know how to count." She tilted her head toward the stairs. "Pick whichever room you like. Tomorrow morning you're helping me count screws." Harold set a key on the table, one he had found in the duty counter drawer, an old key that fit no lock in the building. "This won't open any door here, but you can hang your hat on the doorknob with it." Frank picked up the key and turned it over in his fingers, examining it as though it might suddenly reveal a purpose, and something in his face shifted from bewilderment to a feeling that did not yet have a name, but that would in time come to resemble belonging. Clay arrived on a Tuesday, and he did not come through any door. Eleanor found him in the supply room at the back of the building, crouched behind the metal shelving, with a coil of copper wire in one hand and the other hand pressed flat against the wall, as though he were preparing to push off and run. He was 18, thin enough that his collarbone was visible through his t-shirt, and his face, when he turned it toward the flashlight Eleanor was holding, had the alert feral expression of an animal caught between fight and flight. "Put it down." Eleanor's voice was level, not loud, not soft. The voice she had used on construction sites when a junior worker was about to make a mistake that could hurt someone. Clay set the wire on the shelf. His hand was shaking, but his jaw was set, and he met her eyes with the defiant blankness of someone who had already decided that nothing good was going to happen next, and was prepared to accept whatever punishment arrived because punishment at least was familiar. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. 18 years old. Dirty clothes, dark circles under his eyes. A sports duffel bag with frayed straps dropped near the doorway, packed with the lumpy desperation of someone who had shoved everything they owned into a single container without folding anything. "Sit down." She pointed at an overturned steel drum near the shelving. "Talk." Clay sat. He talked the way people talk when they have rehearsed a story down to its most compressed form. His mother had a new boyfriend. The boyfriend did not want a teenager in the house. One bag of clothes. One sentence that functioned as an eviction notice dressed up as parental advice. A few weeks on friends' couches, each stay shorter than the last until the couches ran out and the friends stopped answering their phones. "People in town said this place takes people in." "It does, but it has a front door. Next time use it." She led him to the kitchen. Harold set a plate in front of him without ceremony. June glanced up from the counter where she was slicing bread, looked at Clay's face, looked at Eleanor's face, and returned to the bread without comment. Frank, sitting at the end of the table sorting donated envelopes, moved his chair slightly to make room. Clay ate everything on the plate and did not ask for more. Eleanor put him in the second garage bay behind a partition she built from plywood and old locker panels. He helped her carry the materials without being told, lifting more than his frame suggested he could, working in the silence of someone accustomed to making himself useful as a form of rent. The first real friction came that night. Music blasted from Clay's phone after 11, loud enough to rattle the partition walls and wake Frank in his room upstairs. Frank came down and knocked. Clay opened the plywood panel 6 inches. The conversation that followed was short, declarative, and ended with Clay slamming the panel shut, and Frank standing in the hallway with his fists clenched at his sides and his blood pressure visible in the vein at his temple. Eleanor heard all of it from the stairwell, but did not intervene. The next morning, she handed Clay a box of mixed screws and told him to sort them by size into glass jars she had washed and lined up on the workbench. He worked silently for an hour, organizing each type with a precision that surprised her, placing the jars in a straight row on the shelf, with the focused attention of someone constructing a small island of order in an ocean that had given him none. When he finished, she put a hammer in his hand and pointed at a board that needed nailing to the partition frame. He swung too hard. The nail bent. He swung again. The board cracked. Eleanor took his wrist, not roughly but firmly, the way you take the wrist of someone who is about to cut themselves on something sharp. She repositioned his fingers on the handle, adjusted his grip, and guided one swing through the air without touching the nail. A hammer doesn't need muscle. It needs direction. Clay looked at her hand, holding his at the scars and calluses at the fingers that were stronger than his. Despite being 40 years older and belonging to a woman half his size, something in his expression changed, a micro-adjustment like a lock cylinder, rotating one position closer to open. He swung again. The nail went straight. He did not play music after 11 again. Nobody mentioned the incident. The silence around it was not avoidance. It was the kind of silence that falls after a boundary has been drawn and accepted, the quiet that means the line is understood. Dale Sutter arrived in the third week, and he brought with him a problem that did not announce itself until the damage was already in motion. He was about 50, clean-shaven, wearing a flannel shirt that still held its shape and work boots with unscuffed toes, and he presented himself at the front door with the practiced ease of a man who understood first impressions as a professional skill, lost his construction job, wife and kids in another state, needed temporary shelter through the winter. He knew his way around a building site, and within his first hour at the station, he had replaced a cracked window pane in the upstairs hallway faster and more cleanly than Eleanor could have done it herself. She noticed his competence. Harold noticed his comfort. There was a difference. Competence was a tool. Comfort in a man who had just arrived in a strange place full of strangers was a performance. By the end of his first week, Dale had begun reorganizing the kitchen storage, rearranging the duty schedule Harold had posted on the wall, and offering Clay unsolicited corrections on his sawing technique that made the boy's jaw tighten and his grip on the saw turn white-knuckled. He suggested to Frank that the room Frank occupied, the corner room on the second floor with the south-facing window, would be better used as a storage space, since Frank was the newest resident and should perhaps take one of the smaller interior rooms instead. He said all of this with a smile and a reasonable tone and the body language of a man who was only trying to help. Harold found 3 coils of copper wire missing from the supply room on a Wednesday evening. He stood in front of the empty shelf for a long time, his hand resting on the metal surface where the wire had been. He did not say anything to anyone. He went to the kitchen, wrote a note on a square of paper, and taped it to the supply room wall. All materials in and out must be logged. The next morning, the copper wire was back on the shelf. No one acknowledged its return. Harold looked at the coils, looked at the note he had posted, and added a second note beneath it. This room has one door. It faces the kitchen. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday afternoon. June was sitting in the kitchen folding donated baby clothes when Dale sat down across from her. He spoke in a low, confidential tone, the voice of someone sharing a concern rather than planting a seed. He told her the building was not safe for a pregnant woman. The wiring was old. The water had not been properly tested. There were no medical facilities within 30 minutes. She should think about finding somewhere more appropriate. He knew of a shelter in the next county that had beds for expectant mothers. June said nothing. She finished folding the small shirt in her hands, set it on the stack, and went upstairs. That evening, she told Harold. Harold told Eleanor. Eleanor knocked on Dale's door at 9 o'clock. He opened it wearing the flannel shirt and an expression of mild curiosity, as though he had been expecting a social visit. "I bought this place for $7 and 43 years of work," Eleanor told him. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You're here because I opened the door. But a door that opens can also close. Helping means asking before you act. It does not mean rearranging someone else's house while they're still living in it. Dale's expression did not change immediately. He held her gaze for a beat too long, the way people do when they are deciding whether to push back or retreat. Then something behind his eyes recalculated, and he nodded slowly. I was just trying to help. I heard you the first time. He stayed 3 more days. On the fourth morning, his room was empty. The bed made with military corners and the chair he had repaired for the kitchen was sitting in its place at the table, still solid, still useful. Eleanor looked at the chair. She did not remove it. The person leaves, the work remains. That too was a kind of truth she had learned from 43 years of fixing things other people had broken. The letter arrived at the end of the month in a white envelope bearing the county seal. Harold opened it at the dining table, while Eleanor sat across from him. And June stood by the stove, and Frank set down his coffee cup. And Clay looked up from the far end of the table where he had been reading a GED prep book that Harold had found at the thrift store. Notice of building inspection. Evaluation of residential use purpose. Inspection of structural safety, electrical systems, water supply, fire protection and habitation standards. 30 days for on-site assessment. June's hand moved to her belly. What if they don't let us stay? Eleanor held out her hand. Harold gave her the letter. She read it again, beginning to end, folded the paper once along its center crease, and placed it flat on the table in front of her. Then we make sure they have no reason left to put anyone out. She began the next morning with a full circuit of the building, the county letter in her coat pocket. Seeing the station now not as a home being built, but as a structure about to be judged. Owen Falk, the retired electrician who had driven out from town after hearing about the station from Pastor Whitfield, followed her upstairs to inspect the outlets and the breaker box, shaking his head at the original wiring, but nodding at the new runs he and Eleanor had installed. Merle Hogan, a plumber. Eleanor had worked alongside on commercial jobs 20 years ago. A man who communicated primarily through profanity and pipe fittings lay on his back under the kitchen sink, replacing corroded sections with the grim focus of a surgeon operating in a field hospital. Whoever plumbed this place in '92 should have been arrested. Merle muttered, his voice echoing inside the cabinet. But the main stack is copper and it's holding. I can save most of it if you get me 4 90-degree elbows and a coupling. Red Perkins arrived with a roll of metal railing, 2 cans of usable paint, and a pile of window glass cut to wrong sizes that no other customer had wanted. Harold made a list on the old duty board. Each task was crossed off when completed. Clay installed draft stoppers under every door. Frank sat at the dining table sorting bolts and fasteners into glass jars with the systematic efficiency of a man whose brain had been trained to organize numbers and was now applying that training to hardware. June painted the upstairs hallway a pale cream color. Working slowly, resting every 20 minutes with her back against the wall and her hands on her knees. Then picking up the brush and continuing. In the second week, Eleanor was welding the emergency staircase on the east side of the building. She had designed it from angled steel and structural lumber, a zigzag descent from the second floor to the ground, with a landing at the turn, and she was halfway through the second flight when her right shoulder, the shoulder that had been lower than her left for 39 years, locked. The pain was immediate and total, a white flash that traveled from the joint down through her arm and up into her neck, and settled behind her eyes like a hot wire pressed against the inside of her skull. She set down the welding torch, sat on the half-finished landing, looked at her hands, which were trembling in a way they had never trembled before, not even on the coldest mornings of the coldest winters of the hardest jobs she had ever worked. She thought maybe Kevin was right. Maybe I am too old for this. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took Harold to walk around the corner of the building, carrying 2 cups of water. He sat down beside her on the landing without asking what had happened. He could see her shoulder. He could see her hands. He did not ask if she was all right because the answer was obvious, and the question would have been an insult. They sat in silence for 2 full minutes. The wind moved through the open framework of the staircase, carrying the smell of welding flux and cold dirt. Lincoln Elementary, 1983. Eleanor's voice was quiet, directed at the yard below rather than at Harold. The foreman told me I couldn't weld a 4-inch pipe. I was the only woman on the site. He said it in front of the whole crew. What did you do? I finished the pipe before lunch. Then I welded the next 3 sections after lunch without anyone asking me to. The foreman didn't say another word about it. Not that day, not ever. She picked up the torch. Her shoulder was still screaming. She welded anyway. But that night, lying on the bed in the duty room with the day's work settling into her muscles like sediment, she said something she had never said before. Her voice came out of the darkness without warning, without preamble, aimed at the ceiling. You're right to worry. I am slowing down. Not my mind, not the way Kevin thinks, but my body isn't what it was. Harold lay beside her. He did not say I know. He did not say I told you so. He reached across the space between them and found her hand. You don't need to be what you were. You only need to be enough. Eleanor turned toward him. For the first time since the note on the kitchen wall, she faced him in the dark. She could not see his expression, but she could feel the shape of his hand around hers, the fingers that had never held a wrench or a torch, but that had held the hands of 1,000 frightened children and had never once let go too soon. She did not pull away. She did not turn her back. 3 weeks passed in the smell of paint, the sound of saws, the percussion of hammers, the hiss of water being tested through new joints. Eleanor completed the emergency staircase. Owen replaced every light fixture in the kitchen and ran new circuits to the upstairs bathroom. Merle installed a ventilation fan and connected the gas line to the stove, properly muttering the entire time about building codes and the particular species of fool who had run the original gas fitting through a load-bearing wall. Harold called the county health office to have the water source tested and placed the clean results into a plastic folder alongside the property transfer papers and the building plans Eleanor had sketched on the back of grocery bags. On the morning of the inspection, everyone woke before dawn. Harold wiped the kitchen counter one final time. Frank adjusted his collar. Clay swept the front yard with a push broom he had found in the supply room, working in long, precise strokes, as though the tidiness of the gravel could influence a government official's opinion about load-bearing walls. June set a fresh pot of coffee on the counter and placed 5 clean mugs in a row beside it, one for each of them and one for the inspector, because hospitality, she had decided, was also a form of structural integrity. The county's white sedan pulled into the yard at 9:12. The man who stepped out was wearing a gray jacket and carrying a clipboard and a pen, and the expression of someone who had been doing this job long enough to know that most buildings fail and most people argue, and that both activities are equally pointless. Eleanor was standing at the front door. She extended her hand. Elena Marsh, this is my home. The inspector shook her hand, looked up at the facade, and walked inside. He stopped in the duty area. The light shone evenly down the corridor. The faint smell of soup hung in the air. Each partitioned room upstairs and down had a door that closed, a bed, a fire extinguisher mounted at the correct height, and a smoke detector screwed into the ceiling. He moved through the building methodically, writing, constantly checking outlets with a voltage tester, running faucets, opening and closing windows, examining railings, testing emergency exits. He went out to the backyard and inspected the water tank, the rain drainage, the woodpile stacked against the rear wall. When he reached the emergency staircase, he stopped. He stepped onto the first tread and bounced, stepped to the second and bounced again. He bent down and examined the welds, running his thumb along the bead the way Eleanor ran her thumb along pipe joints, reading the metal by touch. Who built this? I did. Have you worked with steel structures before? I work with whatever needs to stay standing. The inspector wrote another line on his clipboard. He went through every remaining area of the building, spending 40 minutes total, and then returned to the kitchen. He turned several pages, removed his glasses, and set them on the counter beside the row of coffee mugs. 3 items need correction. An illuminated exit sign at the end of the upstairs hallway, 1 handrail on the outside of the front steps, and an additional carbon monoxide detector near the gas stove. Eleanor nodded. Done this week. The inspector capped his pen. Everything else passes. I'll sign a conditional approval of habitability. Once those 3 items are addressed, I'll return for a follow-up. Harold's hand found the edge of the kitchen counter and gripped it. Clay looked at Frank. Frank looked at the floor. June lowered herself into the nearest chair, as though her legs had simply decided without consulting her that standing was no longer necessary. The inspector signed the form, tore off 1 copy, and placed it on the table. He picked up his glasses. Before leaving, he turned and looked at the row of rooms visible from the hallway at the doors that closed at the smoke detectors at the clean floor, and the painted walls and the small squares of paper stuck everywhere. Harold's notes marking dosages and names and preferences, the written evidence that someone in this building was paying attention to every person under its roof. Do those doors lock from the inside? Yes. He nodded once and walked out to his car. The engine started. The white sedan pulled away down Mason Ridge Road and disappeared around the curve, leaving behind a silence that was not empty but full. The silence of a building that had just been told it was allowed to keep being a home. 3 days later, Red brought the illuminated exit sign. Owen installed it. Merle mounted the carbon monoxide detector. Eleanor welded a handrail to the front steps, her shoulder burning with every pass of the torch, her hand steady despite the pain. The follow-up inspection lasted 10 minutes. The inspector left behind a 6-month temporary residential use certificate and a set of instructions for applying for non-profit conversion status. Harold took the certificate and placed it in the plastic folder with the water test results and the property papers. Then he took a fresh square of paper from his pad, wrote 2 words on it, and stuck it to the wall beside the kitchen door, where everyone would see it on their way in and out. The note said, "We passed." The newspaper article ran on a Thursday, tucked into the community section, between a notice about a church fundraiser and a photograph of a high school wrestling team. The headline was modest, the story was not. A reporter named Gillian Fossey had heard about the fire station from someone at the county clerk's office, had driven out to Mason Ridge on a gray afternoon, and had sat in the kitchen for 3 hours drinking coffee from the chipped mug while Harold told her everything from the beginning. Eleanor had refused to come out of the workshop. "He tells it better than I do. I just fix things." The reporter wrote that down too. Within a week, the story had migrated from the printed page to the screens of phones and computers in ways that Harold did not fully understand, and Eleanor did not care to. People began arriving at the station, not as residents, but as contributors, carrying with them the physical evidence of a community deciding 1 carload at a time that this was worth preserving. Blankets in garbage bags, grocery store gift cards in envelopes with no return address, lumber stacked at the edge of the yard by someone who drove away before anyone could see their face. 2 mattresses wrapped in plastic leaning against the garage door one morning, like visitors who had arrived while everyone slept. A set of dining chairs from a restaurant that had closed on Main Street, mismatched but solid. A box of children's clothing from the women's group at the Baptist church, packed with the precise folds of people who understood that dignity resides in small things. And then Martin Cross arrived. He drove a dented Honda sedan with a briefcase on the passenger seat and a coffee stain on his tie, and the slightly harried expression of a man who took on more pro bono work than his partners approved of. He was 43 years old, a family law attorney from the next town over, and he had read Gillian Fossey's article during his lunch break and had immediately recognized in the detail about the property transfer, buried in the 7th paragraph, the specific shape of a crime. He sat at the kitchen table across from Eleanor, with the county transfer documents spread between them. He read each page slowly, turning them with the tips of his fingers as though the paper itself were evidence. Harold stood at the counter with his arms folded. June sat near the window, pretending to fold laundry, listening. "This signature is not yours." Martin's voice was flat with professional certainty. Eleanor looked at the signature on the page. She had seen it once before at the county office, but seeing it again in the kitchen of the building she had rebuilt with her own hands gave the forgery a different weight, the weight of a lie sitting inside a truth. "No." "Have you ever signed a power of attorney?" "Never." Martin gathered the pages and squared their edges against the table. "I'm going to file a fraud complaint with the county and a motion to suspend the property transfer. I want to be clear about the timeline. This will take months, possibly more than a year if Kevin contests. You'll need to be prepared for that." Eleanor looked at him. "I've been prepared for long things my entire life." Martin filed the complaint the following Monday. The county acknowledged receipt, assigned a case number, and the machinery of law began to turn at the speed that legal machinery always turns, which is the speed of geology compared to the speed of loss. But something unexpected happened 3 months later, in early summer. When the dogwood trees along Mason Ridge Road were thick with white blossoms and the fields on either side had turned from brown to a green, so vivid it looked artificial. Martin called Eleanor's phone while she was in the workshop cutting boards for a new shelving unit. She set down the saw and answered with sawdust still on her lips. The buyer had withdrawn. The transaction had been flagged by the court as potentially fraudulent, and the title company's insurer had refused to underwrite the transfer. The conveyance was void. The house on Alder Street had been restored to the name Elena Marsh on the county deed. Kevin had been served with a court summons and a restraining order, barring him from the property. Eleanor stood in the workshop, holding the phone against her ear. The saw still warm on the bench beside her, the smell of cut pine in the air. She did not speak for several seconds. Martin waited on the other end, accustomed to the silences that follow news that is simultaneously a victory and a wound. "Thank you, Martin." She hung up. Harold was standing at the workshop door. He had not heard Martin's words, but he had heard Eleanor's silence, which was louder than any sentence she had ever spoken in their 45 years together. The house is ours again." Harold leaned against the doorframe. The workshop was full of the evidence of 6 months of labor, tools hanging on pegboards, scrap wood sorted by size, glass jars of sorted fasteners lining the shelves, like a library organized by weight and purpose. On the wall behind Eleanor, his notes were stuck in a column. Chore rotations, medication schedules, dietary preferences of every person living under the roof. Clay likes coffee black. Frank takes blood pressure medication at 8. June is allergic to peanuts. Each note a small act of noticing. Each one a proof that someone in this building was paying attention to the people inside it. "Are we going back?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, had known it for weeks. Perhaps months had known it since the morning Eleanor welded the handrail on the front steps and stood back and looked at the fire station. The way she used to look at the house on Alder Street, with the particular expression of a woman surveying something that belongs to her. Not because of a deed, but because of the work her body has poured into its walls. "We keep Alder Street," Eleanor said, "but we stay here." She turned back to the shelving unit. Harold watched her pick up the saw, align the blade against the pencil mark on the board, and begin cutting. The sound filled the workshop, rhythmic and certain, the sound of a woman building something she had already decided would last. The call from Diane came on a Sunday evening in late June, the kind of warm, still evening when the light lingers on the fields beyond the station until nearly 9 o'clock, and the air smells of cut grass and the propane from the grill Clay had assembled from salvaged parts in the side yard. Harold answered the phone in the kitchen. He had been washing dishes, his hands still wet, and when he heard Diane's voice, he reached for the towel and dried his fingers slowly, giving himself time to adjust to the sound of a daughter who had been absent in every way that mattered for nearly a year. "Dad, I'm sorry." Harold held the phone and looked at the kitchen wall, at the column of notes, at the chore schedule, at the photograph of the family that had been taken 15 years ago on the porch of the house on Alder Street. The photograph he had carried in his bag through every displacement and hung on the wall of the duty room on their first morning in the station, and which now occupied a place above the kitchen doorway, where everyone passed beneath it several times a day. I knew what Kevin was doing. I knew from the beginning. I didn't stop him because I was afraid of what would happen if I confronted him. Harold closed his eyes. He understood avoidance. He had spent 32 years sitting with children who knew something was wrong at home and could not bring themselves to say it aloud. And he had learned that silence is not always cowardice. Sometimes it is the shape that fear takes when it cannot find the door. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. Diane arrived in early July driving a minivan with her two children in the back seat. She parked in the gravel yard and sat behind the wheel for a long time with the engine off and the windows down, looking at the station through the windshield. At the wooden sign that said "Open Door Station" at the rocking chairs, Eleanor had built for the front porch at Clay, carrying a stack of boards into the workshop at Frank, watering the garden he had planted along the eastern fence with seeds donated by a woman from the farmer's market in town. Harold opened the front door and stood in the doorway. Diane looked at him through the car window. He was thinner than the last time she had seen him. His hair was whiter. The flannel shirt he wore was not one she recognized. And on the wall, visible behind him through the open door, she could see the notes, dozens of them, stuck to every available surface, each one a small piece of his handwriting, anchoring a small piece of someone's life to the wall of a building that had no right to be a home and had become one anyway. She got out of the car. Her children tumbled out after her and ran toward the building with the immediate undiscriminating excitement of children encountering a new space, disappearing through the front door and up the stairs before Diane had taken 3 steps. She walked to where Harold was standing. She did not hug him. She did not cry. She looked past him into the kitchen and saw the table, the chairs, the counter, the stove, the mugs, the shelf of glass jars filled with sorted screws, and she said with the quiet astonishment of someone finally understanding the dimensions of what she had failed to protect, "Mom built this for $7. Yes, sir." Eleanor's voice came from the workshop through the open connecting door without its owner appearing. $7 and 43 years. Diane did not move to the station permanently, but she began driving out every Saturday morning with her laptop and a box of files. And by the end of July, she had organized the station's finances into a system that made the donated funds stretch further than Eleanor or Harold had thought possible. She set up a checking account. She filed quarterly reports. She tracked every expense and every donation in a spreadsheet that grew longer each week. Each line a small record of generosity converted into lumber or propane or laundry detergent or the electricity bill that arrived on the 15th of every month, with the mechanical indifference of systems that do not care whether the people paying them have a story or not. This was how Diane chose to make amends, not with words, with columns and rows and balances that added up, because she was an accountant, and the language she spoke most fluently was the language of numbers that account for things. And accounting for things was, she had realized, a form of accountability. Scott started calling every Sunday evening from the West Coast, and each call lasted longer than the one before. 5 minutes, then 10, then 15, then half an hour. He asked about the building, about the residents, about what needed fixing. He sent money regularly deposited into the account Diane had set up. And the amounts were not large, but they were consistent, the financial equivalent of showing up. One evening in August, the call lasted 45 minutes. At the end of it, after Harold had given him a detailed report on the new bathroom plumbing and the status of Clay's GED preparation, Scott said something that made Eleanor, who was listening from across the kitchen, stop what she was doing and stand very still. "Mom, do you remember when you fixed the faucet in my dorm room at Ohio State freshman year? I told you thank you, and you looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language." Eleanor stood at the counter with a dish towel in her hand, motionless. Nobody thanks the plumber, you said. They just expect the water to work. Harold held the phone out slightly so Eleanor could hear. She did not take it. She did not move closer. But the corner of her mouth shifted just slightly, the smallest possible movement in the direction of a smile. I'm thanking the plumber, Scott said. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at the station addressed to Elena Marsh. Inside was a new tool set, a crescent wrench needle, nose pliers, wire cutters, a torpedo level, and a hard hat with the word boss written across the front in black marker, the letters slightly uneven, clearly hand-drawn. Eleanor held the hard hat for a long moment, turning it in her hands, reading the word from every angle. Then she put it on and walked into the workshop and did not take it off for the rest of the day. Not because of the word, because her son's hand had written it, and she could feel the pressure of the marker in the shape of each letter, the way she could feel the pressure in a pipe joint by running her thumb across the weld. The day Kevin returned was the last day of February, the kind of day that exists in the space between winter and spring when the air is cold, but the light has changed, carrying in it the first distant rumor of warmth. His SUV pulled into the yard slowly this time, without the decisive speed of the previous visit. It stopped near the garage, and the engine idled for a full minute before it shut off. Kevin did not go inside. He got out and stood beside the car with his hands at his sides, looking at the station. The wooden sign, the rocking chairs on the porch, the workshop door propped open with a brick. The garden along the eastern fence dormant now, but with the raised beds visible the architecture of growth waiting beneath the surface. Harold saw him from the kitchen window and went out alone. Kevin looked different, thinner. His hair was uncombed. The overcoat was the same one from a year ago, but it hung on him differently, as though the body inside it had contracted. No briefcase, no polished shoes, sneakers with mud on the soles, and a shirt collar that was not crisp but wrinkled in a way that suggested it had been pulled from a pile rather than a hanger. "Can I come in?" Harold studied his son's face with the practiced attention of a man who had spent 3 decades reading the faces of frightened children. And what he saw was not the Kevin who had presented an investment plan in the kitchen on Alder Street. That Kevin had been armored. This one was not. This Kevin's eyes were red at the edges and his jaw was unshaven, and his hands, when he lifted one to rub his face, trembled with the particular vibration of someone who has been holding himself together for a very long time and has recently stopped. Harold stepped aside. In the kitchen, the evidence of a year's worth of living was everywhere. June sat near the window with her infant daughter, asleep in the wooden cradle Eleanor had built. Its pine slats sanded smooth, its joints joined without nails, held together by the kind of precision that does not need fasteners because the cuts are that exact. Clay was at the corner of the table with a GED practice test in front of him, a pencil in his hand, and the focused expression of a young man who had discovered to his own surprise that he was not stupid. Frank sat at the other end cutting stamps from donated envelopes, a small pile of colorful squares accumulating beside his coffee cup. Each one saved for the baby who had been born in this building, and who would, Frank had decided, grow up knowing that the world contained small, beautiful things if you took the time to collect them. Kevin sat down at the table. He did not place a briefcase on it. He did not announce a plan. He looked at the cradle, at Clay's test, at Frank's stamps, at the notes covering every wall at the kitchen that smelled of coffee and laundry soap, and the particular warmth that accumulates in a room where people have been eating together for months. Eleanor came in from the workshop, sawdust on her forearms, the hard hat with boss written on it pushed back on her head. She stopped in the doorway and looked at Kevin the way she looked at a pipe system, before putting it under pressure, examining every joint for weakness, every seam for the potential to fail. She did not sit. When you were in 8th grade, your friends made fun of you because your mother was a plumber. A woman with a wrench and a blowtorch. You stood there in the hallway and said nothing. You didn't defend me. I knew about it. I never brought it up because you were a child and children are allowed to be ashamed of things they don't understand yet. Kevin's face went rigid, the muscles along his jaw locking into place as though bracing for impact. But you're not a child anymore. You forged my name on a legal document. You sold my house. You left your father and me in an apartment that was scheduled for demolition. Her voice did not rise. It maintained the same level measured cadence she used when diagnosing a system failure, moving from symptom to cause with no wasted words and no emotional inflation. You divorced 8 months before you came to Alder Street. You owed money. You needed the house to cover your debts. You used my name like a tool and you put it back broken. Kevin opened his mouth. Eleanor raised one hand palm out, and the gesture carried such complete authority that Kevin's jaw closed as though it had been physically pushed shut. I'm not asking you to explain. I'm telling you what happened. The court returned the house to my name. Martin Cross filed the paperwork. You know this because you were served. The kitchen was silent except for the baby's breathing in the cradle, and the sound of the pencil clay had set down on the table, rolling slightly toward the edge before stopping against his wrist. Kevin looked at the table surface. Then he looked up, and his eyes moved around the kitchen, one more time, slowly, as though he was seeing it for the first time instead of the second. The cradle, the stamps, the practice test, the notes on the wall, the hard hat on his mother's head. The photograph above the doorway, the family portrait from Alder Street, hanging in a building that had not existed as a home when the photograph was taken. I'm sorry. 2 words. No qualifier, no context. No explanation attached like a receipt. Eleanor held his gaze for a long time. The sawdust on her forearms caught the light from the window. Sorry doesn't rekey a lock that was changed behind my back, but I heard it. Kevin stood up. He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. His eyes went to the cradle again, to the smooth pine slats, to the precision of the joints. That cradle. You built it. Yes, it looks like the one I slept in. Same wood. Something moved across Kevin's face that was too complex to be called any single emotion. It was the expression of a man standing in front of evidence that he has been known his entire life by someone he underestimated, and that the knowing was not sentimental but structural, built into the grain of things, inescapable. He left without another word. The SUV pulled out of the yard and turned onto Mason Ridge Road and disappeared. Harold found the envelope on the chair where Kevin had been sitting. Plain white, no name written on it. Inside, a cashier's check for $12,000 and a handwritten note on a torn piece of paper. This is the deposit from the buyer. I canceled the sale. I'm not asking for forgiveness. The handwriting was unsteady. The letters pressed deep into the paper, written by a hand that was not accustomed to saying difficult things on a surface this small. Eleanor looked at the check. She folded it, once placed it in the plastic folder with the inspection certificate and the water test results and the property deed, and closed the folder. Harold watched her. She did not comment on the amount or the gesture or the note. She returned to the workshop. But Harold did something else. He took a square of paper from his pad, the same pad he had been using since Alder Street, and wrote 4 words on it. He walked to the kitchen wall and stuck it among the other notes between Clay Coffee Black and Frank BP Meds 8 a.m. The new note said, Kevin Coffee Black Unsweetened. Eleanor came back into the kitchen an hour later to wash her hands. She saw the note. She stood in front of it for several seconds, her wet hands dripping onto the floor, reading the 4 words. She did not remove it. She did not add to it. She turned off the faucet and went back to work. Spring arrived the way it arrives in rural Ohio, not suddenly, but in accumulations each day slightly longer than the one before, each morning, slightly less hostile until one Tuesday in mid-April. The light through the east-facing windows upstairs had a quality that was no longer winter light, but something warmer and more forgiving. The kind of light that makes old things look possible again. The non-profit permit was approved. Open Door Station was now a registered community organization, its paperwork filed by Martin Cross, and its finances managed by Diane. Its board of directors consisting of Eleanor Harold, Pastor Whitfield Red Perkins, and Owen Falk. 5 people whose combined qualifications included plumbing, nursing preaching, retail hardware, and residential wiring, which Eleanor noted covered most of what a house needed to stay standing. Clay passed his GED in June. He brought the certificate to the workshop and held it out to Eleanor, who was sharpening a chisel on a whetstone, the sound of metal on stone filling the room with a high, clean note. She looked at the certificate, then at Clay, then at the certificate again. She set down the chisel and reached behind her to the pegboard where her tools hung in order of size, and she took down the crescent wrench she had carried in her portable toolbox since the day she arrived at the station. The wrench that had been with her through the apartment, through the bus rides, through the first night on the concrete floor. She held it out to him. A certificate is paper. This is a trade. Keep it. Clay took the wrench with both hands, and the weight of it in his grip changed something in his posture, a straightening that was not physical but structural. The alignment of a young man who had just been handed evidence that someone believed he could build things rather than merely survive them. June's baby was born on a morning in early March, when the fields along Mason Ridge were still brown, but the sky had the high, clear quality of a season that was about to turn. Harold called the ambulance. The paramedics carried June out on a stretcher, and as they lifted her into the vehicle, she looked back at the station at the windows at the sign at Eleanor standing in the workshop doorway, and she said something that only Harold walking beside the stretcher could hear. He did not repeat it to anyone. But later that day, when the call came from the hospital that the baby was healthy and June was resting, he wrote it on a note and stuck it to the wall above the cradle in the room at the end of the upstairs hallway, the room with the most light, the room where the sign that said "Quiet Room" had been cleaned and rehung. The cradle was waiting. Eleanor had built it over several nights after everyone else was asleep, working by the light of a single lamp using pine salvaged from 2 broken rocking chairs Red had delivered months ago. The wood was old and dry and fragrant, and as she planed each slat, she thought about the only other cradle she had ever built 40 years ago in the garage on Alder Street for a baby named Kevin. Same species of wood, same joinery, same hands though. Those hands had been younger then, unscarred, not yet trained by 4 decades of pressure and cold and metal. And she wondered whether the grain of the new cradle remembered the grain of the old one. Whether wood carries memory the way skin carries scars invisibly structurally in the fibers themselves. By early autumn, every bed in the station was occupied. 14 sleeping spaces, each one built by Eleanor's hands or under her supervision, each one solid enough to hold weight and private enough to hold dignity. The dining table had been replaced by the 8-seat set from the closed restaurant, supplemented by a folding table at the end for overflow. The old duty room had become a small library, its shelves stocked with donated books that Clay organized by genre, and Frank labeled with handwritten tags. The middle garage bay was now a functioning workshop and repair center. Its tools hung on pegboard in order of size, its workbenches built from salvaged lumber, its floor swept clean every evening by whoever was on the rotation chart Harold maintained on the wall. Eleanor built 2 rocking chairs from reclaimed pine and set them on the front porch angled toward the road, but close enough together that 2 people sitting in them could speak without raising their voices. She and Harold sat in them on evenings when the weather allowed, watching the light change over the fields, saying little, the silence between them no longer the silence of people who had run out of words, but the silence of people who had arrived at a place where most things could be communicated through presence alone. Harold's notes covered every wall of the station now, not just medicine schedules and chore rotations, but fragments of conversation observations. Small truths collected from the daily life of a building full of people who had come from loss and were learning slowly to construct something from the wreckage. Someone's favorite meal, someone's birthday. The date, Clay passed his GED, the weight of June's baby at birth. The name of Frank's late wife, which he had mentioned once quietly during dinner, and which Harold had written down and placed on the wall of Frank's room, without telling him, a small act of remembrance that Frank discovered the next morning and stood in front of for a long time without saying anything to anyone. The notes had become the station's memory, a distributed archive of attention and care that served the same function as the load-bearing walls Eliana maintained. They held the structure together from the inside. One afternoon in mid-October, when the leaves on the oaks behind the station had turned the color of rust, and the air carried the first edge of the coming cold, a car pulled up to the gate and stopped. The engine turned off. Two people sat inside for a long time before the doors opened. The man who got out was in his mid-70s, wearing a wool jacket that was too large for him, now carrying a suitcase in one hand and steadying himself on the car door with the other. The woman who got out from the passenger side was about the same age, smaller, moving carefully, carrying a paper bag from a pharmacy in one hand and holding her coat closed with the other because the top button was missing. They stood in the yard looking at the building, at the sign, at the rocking chairs on the porch, at the workshop door propped open with a brick, at the garden along the fence where the last of the season's tomatoes hung red and heavy on their stakes. The woman's eyes were red. The man's face was very still, the kind of still that comes not from calm but from the effort of preventing everything behind it from breaking through. Harold saw them from the kitchen window. He set down the dish he was washing, dried his hands on a towel, and walked to the front door. He opened it and stood in the doorway. And he looked at them. And he saw himself and Eleanor standing in front of the apartment building 11 months ago with two suitcases and the remainder of a life that had been taken from them while they were inside it living. The woman spoke first. Her voice was steady but thin, stretched to its limit. Their son had changed the lock on their apartment in the city. He would not answer the phone. They had nowhere to go. Someone at a gas station had told them about a place on Mason Ridge Road that took people in. Harold stepped aside. He held the door open with one hand and gestured inward with the other, a motion so simple and so practiced that it had become the defining gesture of this building, the movement that turned a structure into a shelter and a shelter into a home. "There's a room upstairs, come in." In the workshop, Eleanor was planning a board for a new bed frame. She heard Harold's voice at the front door, the same words he had spoken to June, the same cadence, the same warmth, the same absolute absence of conditions. She did not look up. She picked up the chalk from the workbench and marked the dimensions on the fresh pine, measuring by eye, calculating the width and length by instinct, the way she had calculated every bed she had built in this station. She marked enough for two. The front door remained open behind Harold, letting in the October air, the smell of dry leaves and cold earth, and the faint, lingering scent of sawdust drifting from the workshop, where Elena Marsh, 72 years old, scarred hands, and a shoulder that would never sit right again, was building another place for someone to rest. On the kitchen wall, among the dozens of notes Harold had written over the months, among the medication times and coffee preferences and birthdays and small recorded truths, there was a new one he had stuck up that morning before anyone else was awake. He had stood alone in the kitchen in the gray early light, holding the small square of paper, reading what he had written, and then pressing it to the wall with the palm of his hand, holding it there for a moment longer than necessary, as though the warmth of his skin could seal it permanently to the surface. It said, "This floor is ours." Outside, the wind moved through the yard, carrying the dry music of October leaves across the gravel, past the garden, past the rocking chairs, past the open door where two strangers were stepping across the threshold into a building that had been abandoned for 25 years and condemned for most of them, a building that a woman had purchased for $7 and remade with her hands, a building where every wall was covered with small pieces of paper that said in 100 different ways the same thing. "You are here. Someone noticed. The door is open."